Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Duende live stream. We have a lot of good stuff to go over today. We have a lot of stuff launching. Actually, if you go to NuGet, you can find all that stuff, but we'll get into it as soon as the live stream starts. But before we start, thank you for joining us, for one. And then before we start, we'll do some little housekeeping here. So if you're watching us right now, on YouTube. Thank you. You can ask questions and engage with our community and engage with the folks in this live stream using the live chat. The first thing everyone always asks in the live chat, is this live stream session being recorded? Of course it is. Yeah, you can watch this later. You can go take the kids out. You can take the dogs for a walk, maybe shovel that snow if you're in the United States, and come back and watch the rest of this live stream. So on that note, let's get started. I want to welcome our Duende team here today. First, we have Joe DeCock, who's the product owner of IdentityServer. Hi, Joe. Wave to everybody.
Hi, everybody. Great to meet you all.
Yep. Next, we have Damian Hickey, who's the chief architect and director of engineering here at Duende.
Hi, friends.
Yep. And then we also have Brett Hazen, who is a senior staff engineer who works directly on Duende IdentityServer.
Hello.
All right. Awesome. So thank you guys. This is going to be a lot of fun. I see there are folks already in chat. So again, please feel free to ask questions, engage with each other. You know, it's all about that. So, and yeah, because we're on YouTube, this is a good time to ask. Let's do the YouTube begging dance, which is please like this video if you're watching, hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel for any new content coming up. So we really appreciate that. All right, let's get to the agenda today. This agenda is really 4 parts. First of all, we're going to talk about Duende IdentityServer, the v7.4 release, and how it relates to the .NET 10 LTS. Next, we'll be talking about everyone's favorite topic, AI, and specifically the model context protocol work that we've done in IdentityServer, followed by our BFF release and our new Duende Product Insiders program. So on that note, let's get started with our first point, which is IdentityServer 4. And I'm going to pass it on to Joe.
Thanks so much, Khalid. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I really appreciate everybody's time. As Khalid mentioned, I'm one of the engineering leads at Duende, and I led the development of IdentityServer 7.4, which makes me really proud to share it with all of you today, and really appreciative of everybody coming here to hear from us. So on that note, let's jump right into IdentityServer 7.4. Now, I think most of the folks on this stream probably are familiar with IdentityServer, but if you're new here, IdentityServer is Duende's flagship product. It's a flexible, standards-compliant SDK for building an external identity provider using OIDC and OAuth. So if you need single sign-on for a variety of applications that you have internally, or you need to authorize your many APIs and you want access tokens, or you need to federate to manage a whole bunch of other IDPs, and you want to shield all your applications from the complexity inherent in dealing with multiple IDPs, a great solution is to use IdentityServer to build your token server. A lot of people say you should never roll your own security, and I would amend that to say never roll your own security unless you have a really great framework. And that's where IdentityServer comes in. We've been implementing OAuth and OpenID Connect for the better part of a decade. So you can build your own identity provider and rely on IdentityServer and rely on us to deal with the tricky protocol details, the tricky security details, so that you can be confident that your custom solution is not rolling your own security. So what's new today is we have a brand new version, excuse me, a brand new version of IdentityServer, version 7.4. And there's a couple of highlights. Khalid mentioned them at the outset with sort of the agenda. The thing I'm going to highlight today is the fact that we are now supporting .NET 10, which is actually a really big deal. Why does .NET 10 support matter? Well, the biggest, most important reason is that you get long-term support from both Duende and Microsoft. Support means, in this context, that you're going to get security patches. Critically, I mean, there are other things that are going to support, but the sort of most important critical piece of support is that you're going to get security patches if there's a vulnerability. And this is not some theoretical consideration by any stretch of the imagination. Microsoft has vulnerabilities that they're patching in .NET periodically. We've actually had 2 CVEs in the entire history of IdentityServer. So every once in a while, we need to fix those bugs as well. And when that happens, it's just critical to be able to easily apply a patch. Just back in October, like about 2 months ago now, we're already in December, time flies. But just back in October, there was this request smuggling vulnerability in .NET. It got the worst ever, the most severe ever CVSS score that I've ever seen of 9.9. What this was with request smuggling, just a brief aside on it, because I find this stuff really fascinating, is an attacker can take an HTTP request that's malicious and hide it inside of another HTTP request that looks benign. Then when that benign looking HTTP request comes into your system, security controls look at the outer HTTP request and it looks like everything's fine. But now you've smuggled the inside request past whatever security controls you have in place. So if you have some kind of a firewall that's watching for bad activity, bad incoming requests and protecting you, well, an attacker could bypass that if they can craft a special HTTP request that hides another HTTP request inside it and manage to fool the underlying system to process that HTTP request. This can lead to all kinds of bad outcomes depending on your software architecture, because there's so many security controls that are actually enforced and applied at the network layer that you can smuggle past. This can result in escalation of privileges. You can bypass CSRF, you can do injection attacks, all kinds of scary stuff, hence the 9.9 CVSS score. So crucially though, when something like this happens, back in October, when we all saw this happen, if you were on .NET 8 or .NET 9, or I suppose if you were some brave soul using .NET 10 previews, because in October, .NET 10 was still in preview, Microsoft announced, they responsibly disclose this vulnerability. And when they do, they publish a patched version of .NET that fixes this problem. So it's very straightforward to apply that patch. All you have to do is update your NuGet package version, rebuild, and deploy. But if you're stuck on some old version of .NET, if you're on .NET Core 3.1 or something, Microsoft didn't, make a free public release of these packages that had this fix in it. So you're going to be in a much worse position. It's going to be much more difficult to deal with critical security vulnerabilities if you're not on a supported version of .NET. Which brings me back to why it's so important to keep your identity server up to date and on a supported version of .NET. .NET 10 is a great time to roll forward onto an upgrade, because it's what's called a long-term support release, or an LTS release. Microsoft does their .NET versions alternating year by year. The odd number releases, last year's .NET 9 was a short-term support release, so supported for 2 years. And now .NET 10 is an LTS, a long-term support release supported for 3 years. So if you adopt an upgrade to IdentityServer 7.4 and .NET 10, you're getting this commitment from Microsoft to security patches for a long time, and you can be secure and safe for this sort of long-term commitment. Similarly, Duende has made a long-term commitment to supporting IdentityServer through the life of .NET 10. So that's the sort of like eat your vegetables reason why. Like, let's be responsible adults and make sure that our security posture is good, that we're easily able to apply security patches if we need to. But then once you've eaten your vegetables, you get to have a little dessert, right? And that's where, I mean, as a software engineer, programming brings me joy. And if you give me new tools, it makes me happy. And I hope it brings you joy too. I hope that it's fun. It should be fun to build software. And there's all kinds of fun stuff in .NET 10. So, eat your vegetables and then go enjoy the syntactic sugar of fieldback properties or null conditional assignment. Try out the neat hacks. I don't know if you guys have seen this. There's something absolutely crazy I saw on Reddit the other day where somebody's like ported a Haskell library into C#, and then because of the extension members feature in .NET 10 and C# 14, they can make all the operators inline as if you were somebody who was going to say that, well, technically, a monad is just a monoid in the category of endofunctors. I'm not into that kind of thing. I'm much more grounded in practical security kinds of stuff. I'm not saying you should go do that today, but like, come on, like a neat hack like that, it piques my interest. I appreciate a neat hack, even if I'm not going to put it into IdentityServer, or if I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting it into an IdentityServer implementation. Then beyond that, there's some great new tool enhancements that are available in .NET 10. One of the best ones I want to highlight for you is the .NET DevCerts tool. So from the command line, you can go .NET DevCerts and like create an HTTPS certificate so that you can, or a TLS certificate so you can use HTTPS in your local dev environment. Up until now, that created a certificate that worked for localhost, and you could end up with, have app 1 and app 2 that are both doing single sign-on, and then you also have another app that's your identity server. All three of those are localhost : some random port, which works fine, but if you want to test the way that cookies behave in a really realistic way, it's better if you use a .localhost top-level domain. So what that does, if you're unfamiliar, is that browsers will redirect anything with a .localhost top-level domain back to the loopback device. It's just like going to localhost. You end up back at 127.0.0.1, but now you can have app1.localhost and app2.localhost and identity.localhost. And because they're different domains, different sites, cookies are handled in the browser in a more realistic way, right? This avoids the common problem of like, oh, well, it works on my machine, but then when you go to deploy it, like, oh, the same site cookie properties weren't quite set right because ports are a little different than host names, for example. And so now the .NET DevCerts tool creates a certificate that works with the .localhost top-level domain. So that's a great tip and a nice little tool. Just little dessert for you. Then finally, the last interesting .NET 10 feature that I want to mention, it kind of straddles the line between eating your vegetables of like enhancing your security posture and being something new and a nice toy to play with. As a Midwesterner who just ate a Thanksgiving meal, we like to put marshmallows on our sweet potatoes. So mixing dessert and vegetables kind of makes sense to me, at least. Anyway, the topic I'm talking about is passkeys. So if you're not familiar, passkeys are a relatively new authentication mechanism that is passwordless and phishing resistant. And the way that a passkey works is by creating cryptographic secrets that are managed by an authenticator. The authenticator can either be your device, like your iPhone, or it could be some external key, like a YubiKey. And then the authenticator creates these cryptographic secrets for every site that you want to authenticate with. Each site gets its own distinct secret, and the authenticator associates the secret with the site and will only give out a signature. That's fundamentally the mechanism. You have this cryptographic signature, and then you sign something proving possession of that cryptographic signature. Well, the authenticator will only do that for a request from the site that the cryptographic signature is associated with. And so this defeats most phishing attacks. Even if I fall victim to a phishing site, and I'm on evil.com that looks like Gmail, and I'm trying to authenticate, my authenticator sees that I'm on evil.com, and so it's not going to give out my Gmail passkey. So you can kind of defeat phishing this way, and other classes of attacks like credential stuffing just don't make any sense at all in this world because you've eliminated passwords. So what's great in .NET 10 is that ASP.NET Identity now has support for passkeys. We have a lot of history at Duende with using ASP.NET Identity. We've got some opinions about maybe how things could be a little better in the future for user management. And when Damian talks about the Duende Insiders program, excuse me. The Duende Insiders program, one of the things that might be coming down the road is some new alternatives for user management. But today, most of our users, a solid majority of our users, are using ASP.NET Identity. And if you're one of those folks who's using ASP.NET Identity for user management, you can really improve your security posture right now in an easy way if you upgrade to .NET 10 and IdentityServer 7.4. Well, passwordless, phishing-resistant authenticators through passkeys are just built into ASP.NET Identity right away. Martin, who is behind the scenes running this live stream, thank you, Martin. Hi. Martin wrote this wonderful blog series that I highly recommend. It's up on our company blog, and yeah, there's a little code to take you there if you want to check it out. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, I think to me, Joe, my favorite thing is definitely the local host cert. I know it feels small, but like we see a lot of people, especially like Martin and I and Wesley here at Duende, we do a lot of customer support, and seeing people like sharing cookies between apps that are all hosted on localhost is a common development time issue. And this cert thing definitely changes the game for those folks. So we're pretty happy about that from a support perspective.
Yeah, it's really fantastic.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Joe. So folks, if you're interested in upgrading to the latest version of IdentityServer 7.4 and .NET 10, those packages are now available on NuGet. So go check those out. You can upgrade. We also have great upgrade documentation at our documentation site. So if you want to check that out. And again, we have a GitHub community discussions forum. So if you have any questions or run into any problems during the upgrade, folks like Martin and I and Wesley are happy to help you figure those issues out. On that note, let's get to
one other bit of housekeeping. Sorry, Khalid, to step on you. Martin, can you also share the blog post? There's a blog post up today announcing the 7.4 release of IdentityServer. So all the stuff I just talked about in even more detail up on our blog. There's your QR code. Thank you.
No, thank you, Joe. That was awesome. So on that note, we see actually in the chat, people are starting to ask about our next topic. So Brett and I are actually going to talk about the newest feature in IdentityServer 4, which is, I guess, Model Context Protocol support. So Brett, people are asking about it, so people in chat already know what this is, but for folks who are watching that maybe don't know what MCP is, can you maybe describe it?
Yeah, so Model Context Protocol is an open standard for connecting AI assistants and other AI systems to data where it lives. So that could be content repositories, business tools, development environments. So it's to help your models get better, more relevant responses. As with a lot of these tools, they're based on LLMs that know a lot, but they know a lot about the world the last time they were trained. So they don't have access to data that is non-static, that's changing. The example that MCP uses in the spec, one of them is like, for instance, if you're booking a flight, it needs like the LLM doesn't know current flight prices and such. So MCP is a standard for how you can give more information to those tools.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Like, I guess, there's someone in chat right now asking and thinking about dynamic client registration and how they can integrate AI and stuff like that. I know a lot of people are thinking about, we've already built all these systems inside of our organization. As developers, we spent decades building APIs, background jobs, all those things. But how do we maximize our current investments with kind of these new AI investments coming in? So for us, we've kind of been thinking about this. And Brett, like, what are your thoughts about how you can maybe enhance your existing solutions that you have out there?
Yeah, so I think that chart that or diagram you've got on screen is a good illustration because it's showing actors. So AI agents is a new actor. So we already had like users and machines that like users are accessing our data and whatnot through apps that call APIs. We've got machines that do the same thing. But now we have those AI agents and we want to expose that same data or access those same APIs. So MCPs are in some ways a new way of building APIs. So the way I think of them personally, it's like a gateway into your data for your AI agents. So it's you get to build more APIs. So it's more stuff you get to build. We'll take a look at it with a demo we've got upcoming. There's some SDKs that make it pretty simple, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
it's a new way of exposing data. So it's not like necessarily replacing anything, it's additive. It's a new element.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the neat part of MCP. It's like from developers, it's like we've already built these things. We understand how to build APIs, and we're just kind of like supporting a new kind of user within our kind of mindset or in our solution. So from that point, let's talk about maybe how IdentityServer fits into kind of MCP and AI agents and your existing solutions.
Yeah, so if we're building these new MCP servers, we obviously want to have security on them. So we've got this new diagram up there. So the interactive client on here is going to be like your AI tool. So like developers, if you're using something like GitHub Copilot, or maybe there's people on who are using tools like Claude. So they integrate with LLMs like it's showing up there. But then when they talk to the MCP, they need an access token. That's typically how MCPs are secured right now. So your interactive client is going to talk to MCP. It's going to get an unauthorized request at first, and the response is going to be returned in a very specific way that's going to tell the interactive client, like, hey, here's where you can get my protected resource metadata to give the client information about the MCP and tell it which authorization server or servers it works with. And then it's going to go and talk to IdentityServer and get the OAuth authorization server metadata. So that's the RFC 8414 that was part of this release that wasn't previously an IdentityServer. And that metadata is going to potentially indicate dynamic client registration if the instance of IdentityServer is supporting it. The interactive client can then dynamically register itself as a client because it previously wasn't one. So then it's got a client ID, it can kick off the authorization flow, eventually ultimately get that access token, and then call the MCP. So a lot of stuff happens, but it's all kind of behind the scenes for the user, except the part where they actually have to authorize the access and log in. And then the MCP knows about IdentityServer, so it's already got the information it needs to be able to validate tokens. So it's just using IdentityServer in a new way to plug in a new spot in your overall architecture that you need to protect. We should mention, we've got on the slide up there that dynamic client registration is an enterprise tier feature of IdentityServer, so you do need to have the right license to be able to use it.
Yeah, I think folks should also, we'll get into this once we get into the demo, but there's also several enhancements that you personally have done, Brett, to make enabling DCR for MCP a lot easier. So maybe that's a good transition, but Joe, Damian, do you guys want to add anything before we get to demo time or thoughts? Okay, we're good.
Go for it, man.
So let's get to the demo, Brett. Brett's going to share his screen and walk us through kind of all the technical jargon he just went through so you get a better understanding from a code perspective.
All right. Are you able to see my screen okay, Khalid?
Yep, we see it. It's good.
Okay, so this is a demo that exists in our sample repos. Khalid and I also wrote a blog post about this too that's available and goes into a lot of detail. So we're going to look at 3 pieces to that demo. We're going to start with the instance of IdentityServer. I created this instance using the IdentityServer templates. So if anyone doesn't know, we do have templates to make getting up and running with IdentityServer pretty quick. I used the in-memory template just because it was the simplest. So if you've ever used our templates, this program.cs is going to look familiar. I didn't change anything here, but if we actually start looking at how IdentityServer is configured, that's where I did have to change some things. The first thing I did is change this option here. So one of the things we added in 7.4 is we previously had these discovery options. We added a new section for dynamic client registration, and we added what we called a registration endpoint mode. That's going to default to none, because a lot of instances of IdentityServer aren't using DCR, and then you don't actually need it in your metadata. Here I'm setting it to inferred. What that's going to do is use the default route that IdentityServer uses for DCR. There's another mode called static if you do need more control over what value shows up in your metadata. You could potentially be hosting your DCR endpoint separately from IdentityServer. It doesn't have to be hosted on IdentityServer. I've done that in this demo simply to make it as simple as possible. So the rest of this configuration was all what's in the template. And then down here, we'll come back to the config on like the identity resources and scopes that we configured. I'll point out that we have no existing clients because we don't need any pre-configured since we're using DCR. And then here we're calling add identity server configuration. That's going to register all the services with DI that we need in order to enable DCR. And then we're calling add in-memory client configuration store. In practice, in an actual like production scenario, you probably don't want to use in-memory. You want an actual persistent data store, but for a demo, this is simple. So that's all that I changed as far as configuring services. And then in the middleware, the only thing I changed is this call to map dynamic client registration, which is actually going to register that endpoint for DCR. As far as the config, we've got our normal identity resources. We have one API resource. This is going to represent the MCP server that we are protecting. So we've got the URI of that. One thing I'll point out here is I have the trailing slash here. One difference I've noticed between some of the different MCP tools is pretty much all of them, when they make an access token request, are using the resource parameter to get a constrained token, which is good, but there's inconsistencies between if they put that trailing slash on or not. I think it's VS Code is the one that I've seen not do it, but just something to be aware of that might surprise you, and hopefully just mentioning it will help you solve that if you run into it. So then we've only got one scope because we've only got our MCP servers just using this MCP tool scope, and then we do have that API scope defined out here. So that's it for IdentityServer. I will point out that when I built this, I was using the RC1 package, so we've obviously got the IdentityServer package, but then you do need the configuration package as well. That's where all the IdentityServer, or where all the dynamic client registration stuff lives. So that's IdentityServer. We'll take a look at our MCP server next. If you've built any web applications using .NET, a lot of this is going to look familiar. So first we're going to create a web application builder. We've got the server URL we're going to use and the IdentityServer URL hard-coded here. In practice, you'd want to pull that from config, but we're trying to keep things simple for a demo. Then we're going to set up our authentication. And one thing that's going to be different here than what folks are probably used to is we're setting the default challenge scheme to the MCP authentication defaults.authentication scheme. And the reason we want to do that is when an unauthenticated request comes into the MCP server, when a challenge is issued, we want to use the MCP authentication handler. So setting that default challenge scheme is going to do that. And then we are going to use the default authentication scheme from the JOT bearer because we're protecting with bearer tokens, so that's the same. If you've ever used bearer tokens, that's what you're used to.
Brett, where does that MCP authentication defaults class come from?
that comes from a model context protocol.asp.NET Core package. So there are a lot of different packages available for different frameworks. So obviously we're a .NET shop, so we're doing .NET. If you go to the model context protocol repo, they've got information on the SDK there. It's open source, all the code's there. They've got demo, and they've got similar SDKs for other stacks too. So that's what we're using to build the rest of this demo. So anytime we see anything specific to MCP, it's coming from this package. Good question, Khalid. All right, so going back to our code, we're setting up our job bearer authentication. This is going to look familiar to a lot of folks, so we'll just kind of skip over that. Then we're adding the MCP authentication, and in here we're configuring the options for our resource metadata. What this is doing is setting up what data is going to be in the metadata document that's returned from the protected for the protected resource metadata. That's a spec in the OAuth world for a protected resource to be able to advertise metadata about itself. So it can say what its resource is. Typically that's going to be the server URL. You can point to documentation. Here we're pointing to a weather API doc that because we're basically wrapping this API. You can specify which authorization servers your protected resource knows about, and then what scopes it supports. And those are all things that are going to get put into metadata that an MCP client is going to use when it needs to do something like dynamic client registration. So moving on, we've got our normal add authorization call, add HTTP context accessor, that's normal .NET stuff. And then we've got a call to add MCP server. That's going to register some of those services with DI that we need in order to use MCP. We've got this call to with tools, and we're specifying the type weather tools, which is a custom tool we've implemented that we'll look at next. And then finally saying we're going to use the HTTP transport. MCP supports a couple different types of transports. If you want to know more about them, I'd encourage you to look at the spec. We're using HTTP because it's what we want to do for this demo. And then we're setting up a named HTTP client we're going to use in our tool, and then just normal stuff out here for the middleware, except here we're mapping MCP. So instead of like map Razor pages or map or set up endpoint routing, we're just calling map MCP. That's going to create the necessary infrastructure for us. And of course, remembering to require authorization on it. So the tools that we're exposing are pretty similar to implementing like an API controller, except instead of inheriting from API controller, we're going to decorate that class with MCP server tool type to signal to the framework like, hey, this is going to contain MCP tools. And then we implement methods that are decorated with this MCP server tool. And otherwise, it's not too different from code you'd write otherwise. Here we're just creating an HTTP client from a factory. We're calling an API, doing some checks on that result and returning a string. So it should feel familiar for anyone who's ever written a .NET API. The SDK I found was pretty easy to work with. There's a lot of good samples in the repo from the folks that maintain the SDK, but it felt like writing .NET code. It didn't feel like weird at all. Like it was just a normal SDK.
Yeah, the thing I love about the demo you wrote, Brett, is the fact of like you can see if you already have IdentityServer out there or you already have APIs, like you're not revolutionizing your solutions, you're evolving them to include this extra stuff. So you're wrapping API calls and you're using, your IDP, like IdentityServer in this case, to kind of just enhance your solution, which it's a really good like representation of that thought. So
the last thing we're going to look at is a client that I implemented. This is a console app. In practice, you're probably not going to implement one of these clients. Like your actual end users are going to be using some sort of AI tool, but it can be helpful for just like dev time work. Again, this is a package that comes from the Model Context Protocol folks. This one is just called Model Context Protocol, and it just another SDK. So if we look at what we're doing in this console application, we're setting up the MCP server we're going to talk to, setting up a shared sockets handler here, and creating an HTTP client we're going to use. Creating up a console logger factory, and here's where we're getting into the actual specific code of this SDK. We've got an HTTP client transport. If you remember when we were looking at the MCP server, we're using the HTTP transport. So we're setting up some options. Where's the MCP server we're talking to? Setting up some of the OAuth options. So where do we want to redirect to after we've talked to the authorization server? We'll touch on this delegate in a minute. We can set up the client name we want to use for DCR. And then one odd thing that I ran into working with this SDK is typically when you're doing the DCR in MCP, because the MCP server has that protected resource metadata that tells you which scopes it supports, I expected the SDK to read those and then use those scopes in the DCR request, but I found it didn't. Maybe newer versions did, but I had to manually hard code those here for this demo. So just something to keep in mind if you're playing around with that SDK. Things like VS Code, when I was testing around with them, did do what I was expecting them to, but just something to be aware of that may bite you. Once we have all that set up, we can create an MCP client that actually allows us to interact with the MCP server. So then we're going to get all the tools that MCP server exposes, just double check that we actually got some back. And then if we did get a get alerts tool, we're going to see what the current weather alerts for the state of New York are. I mentioned we'd come back to this delegate that was configured up here. This is a lot of code that we're not going to go into, but basically what it's doing is actually creating the authorization request, opening a browser, and then dealing with the authorization code when that comes back. So I already have IdentityServer and the MCP server running, but let's run the demo client, that console app, and look at some of the output from it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, Brett, it's like you're mocking up what would essentially be VS Code or Claude Code or any one of these kind of tools that folks might have on their machines. So most people wouldn't be writing this code, but it gives a really good example of what's happening.
Yeah, and it can be a good way to test things without having to deal with the overhead of other tools if it's simpler during your development workflow. So we could see here, it connected to the server, it figured out from that metadata that here's the authorization server I need to talk to, it made the DCR request, and then that was successful and it came back with a client ID. If we look at the identity server output too and look for DCR, you could see there, yep, we got that request to DCR and we responded with a 201. And then it opened a browser off window, but if I copy this URL and switch over to, are you able to see my browser now, Khalid?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I copied that URL for where it was trying to go. If you've ever used IdentityServer, our normal login page will do that. And then this is probably going to actually throw an exception because I took so long to log in. So we'll just let that fail and restart it. So that was just a timeout because I took too long. And now that I'm logged in, we're going to see, if we look at that output, it went through that same flow. And this time it opened that browser, but it... All right, so the authentication finished. It got its access token, then it went on its way, found two tools on the server called the Get Alerts tool, and it looks like there are quite a few winter weather advisories in the state of New York right now, which isn't surprising this time of year. So that's what we've got for the demo. I'm sure people have questions. Drop those in the chat, and we'll come back to those during Q&A at the end, Khalid.
Yep,
All
we
right.
will. I will say, like, the fascinating thing is, like, as a developer working within an organization, as you build these MCP tools, you can give your business users who are potentially using something like a GitHub Copilot or some other tools that are maybe for non-devs that interact with AI agents, you can give them access to the business data that they would otherwise end up copying and pasting into, say, a chat context or something like that. So it's a really cool way to empower your business units with real information from your organization's data sets that are, at Duende here, we want you to access those data sets, but we want you to access them as securely as possible using security standards like OpenID Connect and OAuth and, DCR at this point. But the big question that people are asking Brett in the comments, and you kind of know where this is going to go. So if we can go to the slides. Brett, you had mentioned VS Code a lot. What's happening in VS Code?
Yeah, well, both VS Code and the MCP spec. So one of the things that happened between when we did this demo and when we were code complete from this release, actually two things. One, VS Code added support for what's called client ID metadata documents, or CIMD. And then last Tuesday, the Model Context Protocol had a new version of the spec that was in draft, but now it's official. And one of the big changes in that was they added support for CIMD. So it's doesn't necessarily replace doing dynamic client registration. It's an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who might not be familiar with what CIMD is, it's currently a draft in the OAuth world. So it's been adopted by the working group, but there's still ongoing work. So it's still going to change before it's finalized. But the idea is that your client ID is going to be a URI. So then when an authorization server like IdentityServer sees that client ID, if it doesn't already know about it, the draft says you're going to append this path onto the URI, make a call to another URI, and it's going to give you metadata about that client. So you do have to be hosting some infrastructure somewhere to expose a JSON document for your client ID, but then it gives the data to an authorization server like IdentityServer to be able to do something similar to dynamic client registration so the client's registered. So it's still in draft, so we're definitely keeping an eye on it. Historically, with IdentityServer, we haven't implemented things that are still in draft, but we're very interested if people still have specific use cases for that. We'd love to hear about them, and we are going to talk a bit more later, Damian, is about a more formal way people can do that, so a bit of a teaser. So yeah, we're keeping an eye on it for sure. I would be surprised if you couldn't implement this through extension points now if you really wanted it before there was like official support.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're running short on time, so I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but there is one other spec too that's related, that's a draft that we're keeping a close eye on, called Identity Assertion JOT Authorization Grant. That's a profile of another draft that's called OAuth Identity and Authorization Chaining Across Domains that solves some existing problems with MCP, because when you log into a tool like Copilot or Claude, you're typically going through your organization's centralized identity provider, but then your MCP servers are secured by potentially another authorization server, and then your user might also have to log in there, and that creates a couple problems. One, it's not a good user experience, but then the authorization decision's not at the identity provider, so this spec is trying to solve some problems like that, so it's what I'm watching with a lot of interest too, because I think it's going to solve some problems. So we're definitely keeping an eye on this stuff because it's all evolving quite rapidly.
Okay. Yeah, those are very, like, I guess in summary, it's still kind of the Wild West when it comes to securing AI workflows and stuff like that. So
yeah,
we're keeping an eye on it, as Brett has said. So yeah, thanks so much, Brett. That demo is awesome. Again, folks, if you want to check out that particular demo, We do have a blog post walking through it, and it is in our samples repository. So on that note, let's get to the third item on our agenda, which is our BFF release. So back to Joe. Joe, tell us a little bit about BFF and what folks can expect.
Yeah, thanks, Khalid. So the version 4 of the BFF security framework is also out today. Actually, we literally released every single an update to literally every package we maintain at Duende. So IdentityServer was one, and BFF is another. And there's a few highlights I'll mention briefly here. Previously, Erwin, who's the lead engineer working on BFF v4, did a fantastic live stream, and there's a whole blog post about that. So lots of content about BFF already out there if you want to see more details. Martin, maybe you can share a QR code for that if we've got one of those handy. There you go. Great. So just very briefly, what the BFF is for and why you need it. The idea with the BFF is that you should manage your tokens on the server instead of in the browser. You need to do that for two reasons. One is sort of a practical reason, and the other is a security reason. The practical reason is that browsers are changing their security model to enhance user privacy by blocking third-party cookies. And this is good for user privacy because it makes it harder for advertisers to track you as you go from site to site on the internet, but it's not ideal for OAuth and OpenID Connect if you're trying to implement OAuth or OpenID Connect in a browser-based application, because there are certain workflows within that space that rely on cross-site or third-party cookies in hidden iframes. Notably, things like the session management and silent login pattern will break if your app and your identity provider are on different sites and the user is using a web browser that blocks third-party cookies. Today, the most notable examples of browsers that block third-party cookies are Safari and Firefox. Chrome also has the option to block third-party cookies, but it's not enabled by default. They've been sort of loosely pulling the football away for about 4 years now, saying, oh yeah, we're going to do that next year. So I'll believe that when I see it. But regardless, some browsers are blocking third-party cookies, and some of your users who are security or privacy conscious are going to opt in to block third-party cookies. And when they do that, the session management and silent login features are going to break. The other more important reason to not put your tokens in the browser is that the browser is an inherently very dangerous place to store security sensitive information like an access token, because it's a shared execution environment by design. We want to have a World Wide Web, an interconnected network of sites, and there needs to be some mechanisms for one site to interact with another, but this means that malicious sites can try to attack you, and this is why so many of the attack vectors, things like cross-site request forgery and cross-site scripting, start with the word cross-site, right? So even if you have an extremely savvy development team who are never going to make a mistake and never going to be under extreme time pressure, or like the server's down in the middle of the night, let's skip the security audit this time because we have to get things back up. Even if that never happens ever, we're already kind of in fantasy land. You also have to worry about all of your dependencies and your transitive dependencies. And I mean, like, my God, have you looked at how many npm dependencies you have if you're running a React app or an Angular? Like any typical JavaScript or TypeScript app these days has an enormous amount of dependencies and transitive dependencies. And if any of those have a vulnerability, an attacker can exploit those to put malicious code into your front-end application. And what this means ultimately is that if you store a token where your JavaScript can get at it, malicious JavaScript can get at that token as well. The solution to both of these problems is to stop storing tokens in the browser and instead manage them on the server side. And this is a happy property of also enabling all kinds of all kinds of security features and protocols that require a backend. Things like back channel logout, and many other things. Now, the way that this works in practice is that you have your front end paired with a server process, which we call the backend for front end, or the BFF, which acts as a OAuth-aware proxy, basically, between your SPA and your APIs. Tokens are all moved server side, and the security model is drastically simplified because the only thing you need to secure the BFF the front end talking to the BFF is a simple cookie, which you can apply all of the well-known and easy to manage cookie security properties. You can mark it as HTTP only, so JavaScript can't ever touch it. And of course, it's going to be encrypted with data protection. You can turn on, hopefully, you can turn on the same site property of the cookie so that it won't accidentally be sent to a third party. Just in general, the security model of cookies way simpler and easier to manage, and so you get some pretty big benefits by adopting this BFF pattern. And also by the fact that now that you've done everything on the server side, things like OIDC session management and silent login patterns, those are no longer really relevant. And so that they would break if there were third-party cookies involved no longer affects you. Now, we've been building the BFF and supporting it for many years. And the thing that we've heard from a lot of our users is that there's some complexity in the deployment that is required up until now, right? So traditionally in BFF v3 and earlier, the way that you would deploy the BFF is every front-end application would be paired with a distinct back-end host application. So if you had, say, 4 different front-end applications, each one of those would have a distinct BFF host. And especially as organizations grow and you get more and more more and more front-end applications, maybe you've got an internal tool for admin users, and you've got several different lines of business. Each one of those has its own website, its own domain, and its own front end. You've got all of these different tools that you're supporting, and every single one of them needs a back-end process. So that can be a lot to manage, right? You've got to procure and deploy and manage the configuration of all of those BFF processes across all of your environments. Even if you're running locally and you want to spin up the APIs, spin up the front ends, and then also spin up the BFF, well, now you've got multiple BFF processes. It's a lot of stuff to manage. So we saw this problem, and in BFF v4, we've drastically simplified the deployment of the BFF by introducing this notion of having multiple front ends. So you can have a single BFF host that secures multiple front end applications. The old model is still supported. So if you're an existing user and you've already got this in place, you can do the upgrade and then maybe think about upgrading, or not even upgrading, but think about migrating to an architecture that is simpler. Maybe reduce your cloud spend because you need fewer backend servers. Great stuff. A bunch of other new features were introduced in BFF v4. It was actually a very, very significant release. Erwin did fantastic work on it. Just briefly mention, we added OTel support. So you get observability into what's happening in your BFF, all kinds of great metrics and dashboards you can build with the data that flows out from OTel. And just in general, we completely revamped the extensibility model and the configuration model. It's a lot faster to get started with your BFF. And when you want to customize it in some way, the extensibility model is clearer now, so it drives you towards the pit of success. As I mentioned, there's a ton of great content already out there about BFF v4, so check out Erwin's release log, his past live stream if you're interested. And yeah, that's BFF v4.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. What's interesting in the chat is folks are really interested in BFF, and they're kind of curious like how their upgrade path would eventually go, and like the developer experience that Erwin has put into BFF v4 should make that migration path and learning path a lot easier. So yeah, this is a good segue to kind of our next thing. But folks who are maybe starting to look at that migration path using the new version of BFF, you may want to stay tuned for what Damian is going to say. So thank you, Joe. Let's go to Damian and talk about the next topic on our agenda, which is our new program called Duende Product Insider. So Damian, tell us, what is this program? What are we looking for? What does it do for people?
Thank you, Khalid. First, though, I would just like to say how proud I am of the team of delivering the 7.4 BFF releases. Also, all of our FOSS libraries got updated as well for this .NET 10 release. On a given .NET release, say IdentityServer has traditionally come a number of months, typically in the February, March. This time around, we worked hard to get the release candidates out within a day or so, I think, of .NET 10. And as you can see here, we've GA'd within a few weeks. So this should give our customers the longest possible LTS support time. So kudos to everybody who put this together to get it out. So very proud of the team.
Yeah, fantastic work. Yeah,
it's great work. Which leads you a bit to the Insiders program. So we've had a number of releases this year. It's been great. We have been furiously working on a lot of new things. So the Insiders program is a place for our customers, engineers, architects to connect directly with the product technology team and subject matter experts here at Duende. The idea is to help us to collaborate with us to help shape our future products and offerings to better suit your needs and to get early access to some of these items as we develop them. So as I said, we've been furiously building behind the scenes, expanding with a very heavy roadmap, looking to expand our offering, covering more aspects and areas that our customers would often either need to self-implement in order to have more complete solutions. So maybe I might drop a few hints that we're looking at user management and all the authentication technology and mechanisms that come with that, expansion of various protocol support. I saw somebody in the chat might have had a question related to a certain protocol. As you said, we're also looking at the future protocols coming up, as you see with CIMD here was mentioned by Brett. Improved configuration stories, admin APIs, more tooling, faster time to production for specific solutions like federation, compliance, profile support for our HR high regulated customers, better story around multi-tenant architectures. We're thinking about better improved support for cloud native architectures, and quite a bit more. So if you're interested in collaborating with us, and particularly any customer beginning a journey in the near future of maybe revamping or looking to think about some of these things, we'd be delighted for you to join us.
Yeah. So how do people join this program? Like, what are the steps right now to get into the program?
Well, right now we've got a link down below. You can see on the chat here. Sorry, on the screen. Follow that. There's a little minor application process just so we can get a handle on who you are, so we can be personal. It'll be a private Discord with various channels. Customers that are early adopter of new products will get special spaces, private, so we can discuss business matters or things specific to them. There will be access to NuGet packages and so forth of early builds of our new items, and looking forward to getting a more connected feel to the product and technology team that we've probably not had a huge amount over the last few years, but we're looking to ramp that up.
Yeah. I can already see in the chat, though, there are folks who are interested kind of like in AI workflows, folks maybe starting to think about like how to scale their BFF solutions. So if you're in chat right now and you're interested, please visit that link on the screen right now. And we're excited to see you in the Duende Product Insiders program. So on that note, I think that's it for now. So let me first off thank Damian, Brett, Joe for being on here. I always love working with these guys. Just awesome people. So thank you. Thank you to the folks watching us. Like always, the Duende community is an awesome bunch of folks. And yeah, we just love working with you. And then finally, thanks to everyone at Duende who makes this possible the whole way from the top to the bottom. me being at the bottom, obviously, but but
Shoulders of giants, Khalid.
Well said, Damian. Well said.
That's very generous of you, Damian. I'll do the YouTube thing again. If you want more information about the stuff we're doing here at Duende, be sure to head to duendesoftware.com. If you're watching us on YouTube, again, Brett, Damian, Joe, do you want to do the YouTube thing? Do you want to ask? Go ahead, Joe.
Be sure to like and subscribe.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Joe. On that note, if you see us on social media, you can follow us on Blue Sky, follow us on LinkedIn. And if you want to have substantive, constructive conversations, there's always our community on GitHub. So on that note, thanks again, guys, and happy holidays.
Have a great holidays. Thank you very much.